away. He ran away successfully. He was away, and he came back to his plantation 30 days later. Obviously, this was insane. Nat Turner returned on his own free will. It is said that his master didn't put any wanted signs or went out searching for him or anything like that. Like, Nat was never said to be caught. There's no records of that. Hello everyone, welcome to the first episode of What They Hide In, where we will talk about Black history, since it seems as if the schools can't really decide if they're going to do it or not. So I guess we're going to teach ourselves on our own. So my name is Brianna Embry Banks, and I am the CEO and founder of a company called My Blackness Consulting, where I work with educators to help reduce systematic racism in education. So for today's episode, we're going to be talking about Nat Turner. And I do have to give a content warning before we get into this. There will be mentions of murder, rape, torture, all of that bad jazz. So if those are things that really bother you, I don't recommend watching this episode. Maybe just hold off to the next one that comes out. So for those who have no idea who Nat Turner is, Nat Turner is pretty famous as he was a slave back in the 1800s. He became a preacher, and he also was part of the Nat Turner Rebellion. So I'm going to get into exactly what that means today. So it's a really exciting story. So some context for you. We're back in around the 1830s, Houston times. So slavery is really heavy. Just to give you an idea how popular slavery is at this point, by the time he reached 1860, there were 4 million slaves in the United States. Our founding fathers even said things that slavery was an evil and necessary, a necessary evil, and that some people argued that slaves actually benefited from slavery to try to justify what they're doing. So for those who are unfamiliar with slavery, essentially slaves were black people who worked from sunup to sundown with absolutely no pay, getting whipped, raped, and essentially dehumanized. They wanted them to stop feeling like humans, and they were treated and meant to feel more like property. Okay. So, and also an idea of the dynamic slave families, oftentimes were single parent households, simply because one parent would end up being sold. It is said that about 1/3 of slave marriages were broken apart because one parent was sold to another plantation. Also during this time, cotton was pretty popular in the fields to be picked by slaves. On average, the slave was expected to pick about 200 pounds of cotton a day. So because Nat Turner obviously was a male, he was expected to pick around 250 to about 300 pounds of cotton a day. It's a lot of cotton. Also, corn and tobacco were really popular in the fields at this time. So now let's get into it. Nat Turner is from Southampton, Virginia. He was born on the plantation of a man named Benjamin Turner. He was born on October 2nd, 1800s. So, Nat Turner was one of the few slaves that was able to learn to read, write, and was taught religion. This is going to be a huge factor in the story, so please pay attention. He was one of the few slaves that was given a little bit more freedom by his slave master. It is believed that Benjamin actually let Nat take classes with his own children, and that's where he learned to read and write. Although this is yet to be proven, it is said within Nat's confessions he doesn't really remember where he learned how to read and write, so it's been speculated that that is where he gained those habits. So as I said before, Nat became a preacher. He actually started preaching at the early age of 15 years old, and he ended up preaching about 5 or 6 different locations. He would often preach in the back of churches. He was not allowed to actually go inside. So again, thinking about the extra freedom that he was allowed with his slave master allowed him to go to different plantations at times and do preach work. He was also eventually allowed to do some like carpenter work at times, it's speculated. And by May of 1825, he was ended up being baptized in front of both white and black people, which is pretty big at the time. And essentially he wanted to get baptized and preach because he wanted to teach slaves something beyond slavery. He wanted to show them that there's more to life out there than just being a slave, and that you actually have something to look forward to, something to dream about, something to want. It was said that Nat ended up telling children's stories of things that actually happened in the past, and the adults listening around him were taking note. They were saying that these events, these stories that he was saying, took place way before Nat was born. And if someone, like an elder mentioned, if you can tell stories from before your time, you got to be a prophet. It's a sign from God. And Nat really took this idea of being a prophet and kind of ran with it. This is something that really meant a lot to him, especially being really close to the Bible, all of the teachings. So, and his mom kind of put that idea in his head that he was here for something greater. So you'll see this kind of take place many, many times throughout his story. So, it is also said within the Confessions of Nat Turner that, again, he was always quoting the Bible and that his idol was Jesus Christ himself. So again, this is going to be super, super important to our story here today. Nat Turner ended up being married to a woman named Sherry, and I know it's said that they at least had one child together. It is also important to note that Nat Turner, during his time as a slave, was also hired out to a man named John Travis, and would end up working also for a man named Joseph Travis, his plantation. Throughout his time of a slave, he was sold 3 times. So, under this time, Nat Turner was under the plantation owner, Samuel Turner. He ended up running away after mistreatment from the overseer. So, overseers are kind of those people in between the slaves and the masters, kind of make sure that they get the work done in the plantation, often scream, yell, whip the slaves to make sure that they keep up to their quota. So during this mistreatment by the overseer, it is said that Nat Turner returned 30 days later. Can you believe this? Can you believe this? Nat Turner, as a slave, got away. He ran away successfully. He was away, and he came back to his plantation 30 days later. Obviously, this was insane. Nat Turner returned on his own free will. It is said that his master didn't put any wanted signs or went out searching for him or anything like that. Like, Nat was never said to be caught. There's no records of that. And it's just said that Nat came back on his own free will. Obviously, the other slaves looked at Nat and was like, "Oh, brother, sit down. What's it? Why'd you come back? What on God's green planet Earth made you come back here?" And it is said that Nat looked at them and quoted a verse in the Bible and said, "The person who does not do his master's will shall be flogged with many stripes." Again, often using the Bible to explain his behavior. And it's really believed that the reason his plantation owner his master never sent out wanted posters or anything like that, because he was almost cocky in the fact that he knew Nat would return. He kind of believed, speculation again, that it's because Nat's mother was still on the plantation. He didn't think he would leave her. So again, that's kind of insane. But we have to keep up with this idea that Nat truly believes that he's here for a greater purpose, this idea that he's meant to be a prophet, the followings of the Bible. So again, let's keep that in the back of our mind. Turner was also believed that he was seeing signs and hearing divine voices from God. Again, this influenced by Christ. Throughout that the slave, and he also thought that, again, referring to the Bible, that the slave owners were something called serpents. He thought that they should be slayed with their own weapons. So essentially the weapons that the slave masters would use against the slaves to torture and dehumanize them, Nat Turner was fully believed that this interpretation of the Bible meant that those same weapons they used on the slaves should be turned around and used on the slave masters. I mean, opinions are opinions. So, again, to get into that, and doing so, he thought that if he would stand up, kind of bigger purpose again, lead this rebellion against the slave masters, that in doing so, he could bring freedom to man. Again, using the same idea as the Bible, that you kind of have to do something great, something grand in order to free man. But Nat understood if he really went through with this and was like using these weapons against the slave masters and killing them and stuff, that he would die, and he would die a very harsh death. He fully understood that, but he also realized that it'd be for a greater purpose, that he would be dying on behalf of his people. And again, this teaching of God really plays a really big message in Nat Turner's life. He believed that God judges by actions. So he believed he needed to do something big, something grand, in order to follow God's teachings. So his original plan to do this was to have the rebellion on July 4th, Independence Day. He thought since that's their Independence Day, he said that's going to be our Independence Day. Unfortunately, though, heartbreaker. Nat Turner fell sick, and they ended up not being able to carry out the rebellion on July 4th of 1831. However, on August 21st, 1831, Mount St. Helen erupted that day and ended up making the sky a really strange gray-blue color at the same time that there was an eclipse. And Nat really took this as a sign from God himself. He said that this is the sign that this needs to happen today. Like, we're going to have to get this up and rolling. So that day, Nat Turner and 6 others ended up killing the plantation family, the Travis family. In the process of this, he not only killed the plantation owner himself, he killed the wife, he killed the children, anyone involved. Anyone, all of them. Ended up getting a hold of horses. Horses are really important because slaves back then were not allowed to ride horses. It was a statue of power and great wealth. So they got a hold of the horses, they took a bunch of weapons, and ended up getting about 75 other enslaved people to join. Kind of in the end of this, they ended up leading to the murder of about 55 to 65 white people, because they ended up going on this journey, going to plantation, killing the plantation owners and their entire families, and collecting slaves along the way to kind of join them in this rebellion, this rise against the slave masters. In this idea, he essentially said that he wanted to kill any white person who owned slaves, but he did say that he would spare the poor white folks who did not own any slaves. So it essentially was a rise up against those who did them wrong. So again, he also, something mind-blowing about Nat Turner. With this education, he understood, with leading such a big group like this, the importance of a military mindset. So what does that mean? Within his followers of the slaves kind of following him through this rebellion, there were rankings. So there was like leaders of them, and then kind of soldiers. It is also said that they marched from plantation to plantation. Nat Turner would give kind of his main leaders some directions on where they were heading, and even without maps and stuff like that, they all would end up at the same place. So the goal of this was to essentially kill, again, as many slave owners and their families as they could, to collect slaves along the way and any weapons they would need. And his goal was to make it all the way to Jerusalem. Again, the preaching of the Bible was only a few miles away. He believed if he could make it to Jerusalem, Virginia, that just like the teachings of the Bible, if he'd make it there, there was a spot there with a lot of weapons. This would be the ultimate revolt, and they would be able to finally, once and for all, take down the slave masters and really force Virginia to dismantle slavery in the entire state. So they ended up lasting 48 hours as they made their way to Jerusalem, also known as the county seat. When they made it to Jerusalem, they ended up being met with 200 members of militia. Obviously, they were not about the slaves revolting and killing all the white people, so they were like, okay, we're going to bring our army back to you. Also, they were met by federal troops. Right then and there, 57 blacks were killed. Many ended up getting away, including Nat Turner. So obviously, Nat Turner went on the run. Everybody and their moms is looking for Nat Turner. They want his head, essentially. He ended up hiding for 70 days. 70 days on the run. That is a long time that this man got away. It is said that he dug holes in the embankment of a tree and only came out at night for food and water. But unfortunately, one of these nights, a dog found his hiding spot in search for his food. So like he kind of sniffed out Nat's food, was like, let me check it out. So eventually Nat kind of like shooed the dog away. But it's also said that a few nights later, unfortunately, that same dog came back, but was followed by a few other slaves. These slaves didn't really do much, but it is said that Nat was kind of afraid that they would kind of a little chit chat and the word would get out about where he's at. So Nat ended up grabbing all his stuff and relocating. Again, keep in mind that the mafia is looking for him this entire time. On the way from hiding from the troops and the mafia and the big crowds and mobs looking for him, it is said that a man named Benjamin Phelps unfortunately ended up coming across our man's Nat Turner and turned him in for the ransom money. And it said that in Nat Turner's mind, it was better to just give himself up once he was kind of caught and held at gunpoint by Benjamin, because at this point, at least he'd have a chance to get through to court, where unfortunately the mobs or the mafia or the troops found him, they probably would have killed him on the spot. So Benjamin ended up taking him in for the reward money, and 6 days later, essentially, they decided to execute Nat Turner. And this is kind of where things take a bit even more of a nasty turn, so understand if you need to fast forward. They ended up lynching Nat Turner by hanging. It is also said that with his body, they ended up skinning him and possibly making purses and other garments out of it. And they handed out different pieces of his body as heirlooms. And many of the other 57 slaves who joined him in their revolt ended up having their heads physically put on a pole. So they were also executed and had their heads put on poles. Actually, to today, like today's day and age, if you go to Virginia, there's a state highway, Route 658, called Blackhead Signpost Road. Blackhead Signpost Road. Tell me that that's not crazy, that's not racist, that they had all these slaves with their heads on poles, and now today there's even a highway named Blackhead Signpost Road. Absolutely insane. It is said that the state of Virginia ended up executing 55 slaves and banished even more than that. Slaves completely just get them away. And there were very few that were actually acquitted of their charges. In backlash of that, because we know the law only takes care of so much, societal views kind of got their own way of handling things in the justice system. So mobs ended up retaliating. They were not about to sit here and watch the slaves kill off their entire families. So from in retaliation of the 55 to 65 white people killed by Nat Turner's rebellion, the mobs ended up killing over 200 black people, many of whom were innocent and had absolutely nothing to do with the rebellion. It is even said that slaves as far away as North Carolina were blamed for the rebellion and ended up being executed because of their possible involvement. Now, let's not forget, Nat Turner had a wife this whole time, wife and a very young daughter. So Sherry, luckily, her master, Gills Reese, don't quote me on these names, it's not it, was actually able to protect her and her children from the angry mobs, because obviously if they were going to kill innocent people, they were definitely coming after Nat's family. So luckily, Sherry's slave master was able to keep her safe during this time. Let's not forget that I mentioned in the beginning ideas that most slave families were torn apart, so she was not actually at the same plantation as her husband Nat during this time. She was with a whole another slave master who ended up keeping her safe. So by April of 1831, Virginia decided to declare that the teaching of blacks, whether that would be free or enslaved, to read or write is now illegal. They also passed laws to stop blacks from preaching. They also said that now they could not meet in assembly or in groups together. They also said that now they cannot get ownership of other slaves. So if a free slave kind of wanted to get a slave of their own and kind of bring them freedom, they are not allowed to do that. in any sort of legal means unless it's a husband or their children. And they also are no longer allowed to own weapons. Whether you are free or a slave, no weapons for you. It is also said that very soon other states in the South ended up passing very similar laws and or codes very similar to those in Virginia, and anti-literacy laws. Really insane. It is also said, as a side note, because again, they viewed us as property. So all the slave masters whose slaves were killed or sent off elsewhere were reimbursed for their lost property. I don't know about y'all, but that is a handful. That's absolutely insane. Whether you like Nat Turner or not, he ended up having a huge impact on history. He was not the first to rise up against the slave masters. There were a few to do it, but he said that he's one of the most, I guess you could say, successful in the fact of actually leading a revolt and like the number of white families that he was able to kill to get to his end goal, even though he didn't end slavery, of which he was originally trying to do. Because of this rebellion, Virginia actually did sit down and have a talk about washing away slavery in Virginia. But unfortunately, they were outvoted by the fact that they wanted to kind of narrow down on those controls, which ended up leading to the anti-literary, no reading, no writing, no grouping laws instead. So I encourage you guys to keep following along for more Black history. So you can follow my channel, Owning My Blackness Consulting. Hit that like button down below and hit the bell for notifications on when I post new videos. And you can also check us out on TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. And I hope you stay tuned for more Black history, because what they hiding? If they're not going to teach us, we're going to teach ourselves. Thank you.